Scotland has always been a crucible of working-class revolt. Its shipyards, mines, and factories gave birth to a succession of radical idealists.
There are no economic reasons to prevent poverty being abolished.
We're going to fight this!
Unions and politicians promised Scotland's workers a new deal.
We felt we were changing the world, and we were.
The struggle for worker power became a battle for political power.
We worked for months winning that project, and then we had the unions mucking it up in a most extraordinary way.
The radicals were weeded out. The heavy industry that bred them lies derelict. The militant rhetoric is silenced. This is the story of a 100-year battle for worker power and the Scots who took on successive British governments in their efforts to win it. Glasgow's George Square was once the fulcrum of a communist battle for worker power. At its heart, the enigmatic John MacLean, once labelled the greatest living threat to British society. A war for workers' rights that would flare and die, but would be immortalised as Red Clydeside. The man who might have been Scotland's Lenin trod the streets of Pollokshaws where the River Cart flows north and west towards the Clyde. 80 years after John MacLean's death, glasses are still raised in memory of the teetotal Glasgow school teacher turned revolutionary.
Here's to John MacLean and all that he said. Here's to John and all the Scottish socialists he made. Here's to his courage, for they couldn't put him down. And here's to Scotland's working folk, their day is coming soon.
Talking about radical movements all over the world, but in Scottish schools, Scottish weans don't even know anything about their own history, their own heritage, radical or otherwise, you know. You'll never hear about the clearances, you'll never hear about the Riot Act getting made in George Square, machine gun nests and tap the city chambers in George Square, that kind of thing.
John MacLean was the sixth child of a Highland Presbyterian family. Graduating in political economy at Glasgow University, he began a career as a primary school teacher. An establishment figure and an unlikely champion of Glasgow's shipbuilders and factory workers. This was an Edwardian Scotland rich in resources and heavy industry. 1 in 5 ships worldwide was Clyde built. By some economic standards, Scotland was then the richest country in the world.
The world came to Scotland to buy. To every country she dispatched the products of her craftsmen's skill.
Yet conditions for the builders of Scotland's wealth were cruel and primitive. High infant mortality and cruel childhood diseases were wretched daily reminders that living conditions were amongst the worst in Europe. Revolutionary politics thrived on these inequalities. John MacLean operated on the left margins of the Scottish Labour Party, Britain's first, formed in 1888. His marriage to Agnes in 1909 and the prompt arrival of their first 2 children had little effect on his tireless round of meetings and public speaking. MacLean and those around him were crafting Glasgow socialism at shipyard gates and public halls. Socialism then was no dry, hidebound theory. It spawned choirs, arts and sport, even Sunday schools.
Socialist Sunday school was always a family affair. As my mother used to say, you got politics for your breakfast, dinner and tea in this house.
They had days out. The 31st of May was always a big gathering in Glasgow, in Rook Glen. They took the children out walking, and there was art, there was drama side of it.
There's standard precepts, which was more or less, you might call them the Socialist 10 Commandments.
Honour good men, be courteous to all men.
Love learning, which is food of the mind.
Observe and think in order to discover the truth.
Stand up for your rights and resist oppression.
Socialism rests on the three principles of love, justice and truth. Where have you heard that before?
They didn't dissociate themselves, from religion at all. And of course, there's many socialists who were strongly religious. I mean, even John MacLean, avowedly Marxist, obviously, talked about taking over the mantle of Jesus Christ.
This new liturgy would be written in the Gospels of Manny Shinwell, Davy Kirkwood, Willie Gallagher, and James Maxton. Disciples of socialism, not of MacLean, they formed a broad and often erratic coalition. The events of 1911 would stitch their movement even closer together. The Singer sewing machine factory in Clydebank was said to be the biggest industrial plant in the world. That year, the American owners introduced quicker, more labour-intensive working practices. They also introduced lower wages. The women were the first to strike.
It was a turning point in terms of the unionisation of some previously low-paid and semi-skilled and unskilled workers, particularly women, and that it also brought in socialist politics and then disseminated it elsewhere on the Clyde.
The organisers were victimised and sacked after the Singer action. But in the 4 years before the First World War, Scottish trade union membership doubled. Most of those unions backed the war effort, agreeing to outlaw strikes for the duration. But from Glasgow sprang a radical opposition to the carnage in Europe. Willie Gallagher would write,
"Thousands went flocking to the colours in the first days. Later, the reality of the fearsome slaughterhouse, with all its long agony of filth and horror, turned them from buoyant youth to despair or madness."
These halls on Glasgow's Bath Street were the focus of John MacLean's anti-war propaganda. Across the street from the Army recruiting office, MacLean preached pacifism and socialism.
"The doom of capitalism is at hand. There will be peace on earth and goodwill to all mankind."
The anti-war movement grew as returning soldiers told of despair, horror and death. But Glasgow was the world's biggest supplier of the shells, bullets and bombs needed to win the war. The government legislated rapidly to quell any unrest. The Munitions of War Act of 1915 made it an offence for any worker to refuse to undertake any job, regardless of pay, to refuse overtime, paid or not, or to leave an employer without written consent. It became known as the Slavery Act.
The employers did try and use the Defence of the Realm Act and the Munitions Act to be able to discipline their workforce. But because there was full employment, for the first time in any length of period, the workers had a bargaining position that they'd never had before.
Their position was often abused. The craft unions, male and predominantly Protestant, were raging against new machines that needed only unskilled workers. Often women, often Irish immigrants. These skirmishes drew strength away from the main battle. Whilst industrial militancy faltered, a broader social action scored a famous victory. As their men fought and died in France, Glasgow's women were outraged by a series of rent increases by the city's private landlords.
They would refuse to pay the rent increase. They would send their rents at the old levels. It would be sent back by the factors. The factors' clerk would go into the districts. A bell would be rung to warn folk that the enemy had arrived, and the women would pelt them with flour, piecemeal, and presumably whatever else they could get their hands on.
These protests, often backed by further illegal strikes, eventually won the case and rent levels were frozen. The people of Glasgow had proved that direct militant action could succeed. But from the establishment position, MacLean's anti-war rhetoric was both dangerous and intolerable. He was charged in November 1915 with making statements designed to undermine recruitment. At his trial, a heckler in the gallery suggested that MacLean should join up and fight with his countrymen. MacLean replied,
"I have enlisted in the Socialist Army, and God damn all other armies."
Refusing to pay the £5 fine, MacLean was imprisoned for 7 days. It would be his first brief taste of incarceration. Early in 1916, he was arrested again. The charges against him based on the Defence of the Realm Act. He was held briefly at Edinburgh Castle before being sentenced to 3 years penal servitude at Peterhead Prison.
We'll have to mind the John when they tax us for defence. They put him in the jail just for talking common sense. A worker can't afford bombs and he hasn't time for wars. A fair share of Scotland's what he should be fighting for.
MacLean was the spanner and the sand and the machinery and everything else. He was holding up that war effort. That's why he became public enemy #1.
MacLean was moved to Perth jail, where the prison doctor described him as
a highly strung, neurotic individual who will never be an ordinary sane man again.
Paroled after huge public protests, MacLean's release coincided with the Russian October Revolution of 1917, when the Bolshevik forces took Petrograd.
Выступивший перед демонстрантами Ленин призвал не поддаваться на провокацию контрреволюции.
MacLean's stated ambition became
to create a Petrograd on the Clyde, a revolutionary storm city second to none.
But his strength was words, not weapons.